This is Yesterzine, the literal magazine show. Every episode we take a magazine from the Golden Age, pass judgment over their best and worst rated titles, and see if the issue has anything to teach us about gaming in the age where the discs were floppy but the games were hard. This week, a magazine that tried to solve the problem of out-of-date content even before the internet made that a serious threat to the existence of magazines. Games X was released weekly, and covered every system going, both in computers and consoles. It was a huge remit, and one ultimately they struggled with. Games X was apparently a huge financial bath for its publisher, and lasted little over a year. It's probably a lucky escape. The founder and managing director, Hugh Gollner, went on to form Maverick magazines, and if you don't know how that went, go back and watch episode 13 to find out just how badly one man can screw up a magazine. Games X never really suffered this, and the instant and constant gratification of a weekly release very much appealed to 11-year-old me, as did its sub £1 pocket money pricing. They packed a lot into their pages too. Our choice, issue 31 from 21st to 27th of November 1991, has 64 pages, and manages to review 33 game and format combinations, with at least one game from 10 different machines, although the bulk were the 16-bit home computers. And it's on two of those we start. The Gaming Heaven is a point-and-click adventure, a genre that traditionally ages pretty well, not being reliant on out-and-out action. This one is from Sierra's long-running Quest range of games, Police Quest 3. And since our cover feature is about how Sierra changed the adventure game, twice, let's start with them. Sierra basically single-handedly created the modern point-and-click. And, with the possible exception of Microprose, there's not another publisher that owes me more of my preteen years. My family started in 1986, as adventure games did themselves, text-based. In our case, on a Sinclair Spectrum. I was young at this point. The first adventure I remember us working through was Level 9's Jewels of Darkness trilogy, but to be honest, at this point I could tell you shit all about it. I only know the name because I tracked it down just now using only the knowledge that it was a Spectrum text adventure trilogy that came in a blue box with a vaguely fantasy theme, and that at least one of the games used pedestals, because I could never spell that as a kid. Things changed for me in 1989 when we got a PC and discovered the more graphical Quest games. Sierra had been around for a while by that point. Ken Williams, the founder, was always a visionary. 10 years earlier, in 1979, he'd founded a company called Online Systems, well before that was even a term for most people. While Ken was a technology and marketing visionary, he was not the creative power behind Online Systems. It was his wife Roberta who had become the gaming legend. Stuck at home after the birth of their second child, she ended up playing a text adventure called Colossal Cave on a borrowed business terminal. Once she completed that, Roberta found very few similar games, and ultimately decided both to develop her own and investigate the possibility of adding at least static graphics to aid with scene setting. The script for her first game, Mystery House, was written in 3 weeks, partially based on an Agatha Christie novel, and with help from Ken and a borrowed Apple II, the idea was turned into a functioning game over the next several weeks. This was a convoluted process that required Ken to rewrite the software that came with the VersaWriter tracing device they used to create the scenes, and then come up with an entirely new vector image format in order to store the line drawings small enough to fit the game onto a single Apple II disc. I shan't spoil any of the game, because it's been freeware since 1987, and is officially the first graphic adventure game. It's a piece of history you might want to take a look at. Tentatively advertising the game in Micro magazine to see if there was a market, the couple were astonished to sell 10,000 copies through mail order at $25, making the tiny company around $500,000 in today's US fund bucks, and the game immediately became the making of the company, leading to it being fully incorporated as Sierra Online later that year. The name came from the same mountains that Apple later referenced in their operating system names. Sierra, probably through sentimentality, would support the increasingly aging Apple II for another decade. The same tracing and programming process was used to release another 6 games in the so-called High-Res Adventure series, each one being designed or programmed by at least one of the Williamses, most notably a tie-in game for the Jim Henson movie Dark Crystal. Their most infamous product of the era, though, was the only pure text adventure Sierra would ever publish, bought incomplete in order to give them what they considered a more adult offering. Soft porn adventure. If you're a denizen of the internet, you might remember this being superbly dramatised in full by Octavius a year or two back, and there's absolutely nothing I'll be able to say that tops their performance, so I won't bother and just link that video. All I'll add is that the company was still small at this point, to the extent that the advert for the game features 3 Sierra employees and a waiter from the local restaurant. That's Roberta herself on the right there. The advert, and identical box art, was predictably controversial, but soft porn sold 50,000 copies, which was about 1 copy for every 4 Apple IIs that existed at the time. There was also a neat side effect that stores ordering it tended to order other Sierra games at the same time, resulting in huge overall growth for the company. If you read the plot of Softcore and find it familiar, by the way, the first Leisure Suit Larry game from 1987 is basically a straight remake of it, leading to one of Sierra's longest running series, the 4th title of which is also reviewed in this very issue of Games X. Yeah, 4th. Despite the title, we don't ask. It's a long story. Sierra grew, publishing games from other developers, including the first Ultima game on Apple II and the second Ultima game on everything. But it was Roberta's next big project that would change everything. King's Quest, The Quest for the Crown, was still a text-based adventure game, but now you controlled Sir Graham directly. This is where the point and click as we know it begins, although minus the actual pointing and clicking. Events could actually happen in real time in the game world that would affect what you were doing. Puzzles could be location or time-based, and the entire thing felt much more like a place you inhabited and indeed quested through. For want of a specific distinction, King's Quest is the first 3D animated adventure game, and this is still as early as 1984. The Quest branding would be Sierra's go-to through the second half of the 80s and the first half of the 90s. Also a near constant was the adventure game interpreter in the 80s, and its replacement, the Sierra Creative Interpreter, in the 90s. These scripting systems, similar to LucasArts' later SCUM system, allowed a game to be quickly ported to multiple systems, with all of the AGI games coming to PC, ST, and Amiga, and all but one to the by now incredibly creaky Apple II. The Fantasy King's Quest series spawned 6 immediate sequels over the next 20 years, as well as a remake of the first game using the SCI, all of which involved Roberta. But Quest rapidly became much wider. Space Quest appeared in 1986, Police Quest in 87, Leisure Suit Larry in 87, and Heroes Quest in 1989, rapidly retitled to Quest for Glory when unsurprisingly Games Workshop wanted a fairly loud legal word. The adventure game engines were also used for kids games like Mixed Up Mother Goose, the Dr. Brain series, and also Quest-like games, such as Freddy Farkas' Frontier Pharmacist. So what went wrong, given that we're not all playing King's Quest XI right now? A few things really. Unsurprisingly, as the undisputed kings for so long, Sierra may have played it a little too safe by the 90s. While the SCI was introduced for King's Quest IV, at that time it was still fundamentally a text-based system. Commands were typed by hand, although at least now the game paused when you did it. Further, the games still found themselves hamstrung by some illogical old-school puzzle design that, as late as King's Quest V, meant you could lock yourself out of completing a game by not doing something early on. Sierra were also not shy about using constant player death as punishment for doing the wrong thing, making saving every 5 seconds the name of the game. Of course, all of the others were learning from this in various ways. Delphine, most famous for Flashback and Another World, used their brilliant aesthetic abilities you see on those titles to create the Amiga games Future Wars, Operation Stealth, and the innovative and unique Cruise for a Corpse between 1989 and 1991. Then they made Shaq Fu and a bunch of very average motorbike games for some reason and died. The real torch, therefore, was passed to Lucasfilm Games, later LucasArts. As early as 1987, when Sierra were releasing AGI titles like Leisure Suit Larry 1 and Space Quest 2 that used the earlier version of their text parser, Lucasfilm released Maniac Mansion, with the now much more familiar verb list at the bottom of the screen. This had two effects. One, it was a much easier to play game as you weren't hunting for the exact synonym the game had in mind, but also allowed the game to be played entirely with a mouse or controller. Maniac Mansion had a very successful NES version, a trick copied by a licensed port of King's Quest using a very similar system on the Master System in 1989. This title notable for being one of the very few Master System games to be a North America exclusive. By the time Sierra were launching their enhanced text parser games, Lucasfilm had already got a full grip on both their design and the SCUM script system. Sierra did react, and by the time of Police Quest 3, had managed to move to icons. And since Police Quest 3 is the gaming heaven in this issue, let's take a break to look at that now. So as mentioned, I grew up with Sierra, right from when we acquired that first PC in 1989, and many of the Sierra games were worked through, especially the Space and King's Quest series. Police Quest though, I've only ever played the second one, so I'm not coming to this specific game with any nostalgia. GamesX reviewed the PC and Amiga versions, giving it a full 5X's, making it a full quarter better than a can of Castlemine. Given the PC version was first out, looks prettier, and I don't have to spend my life swapping discs, let's concentrate on that one. The intro explains why Police Quest is a little different to most adventure games. The designer is an ex-US detective, and he brought a lot of actual procedure to the game. One thing we did notice in Police Quest 2 is that sometimes this was a little to the detriment of the game. I remember that not specifically putting on ear defenders before trying out the shooting range at the police station was an instant game over for breaking police procedure. Realistic, sure, but it feels like something a game should do for you. I don't like when your character breaks character. Sonny Bonds would know he needs ear defenders, so put them on for me. That's not a puzzle, that's just a mistake you'll make once because you shouldn't have to do it, and then never do so again. While we're here though, what is Jim standing on there? His foot is in mid-air off the front of the car. And also, I'm not even sure I want to know what's going on here, in the crotchal area. Has he just returned from a call to your mum's house or something? In the game, Police Quest 3 is just off the end of the text parser era. And on the face of this interface, Sierra are actually a couple of years ahead of LucasArts, with a purely icon-driven control when Lucas was still using the verb list. One thing you immediately miss from a more modern adventure game though is hotspot highlighting, especially when the world is in this lower resolution. And LucasArts did have that by this point. It's all the more important because Police Quest 3 does exhibit the legendary Sierra fussiness. Here's an example. To use the lift, you don't use the lift. You have to use the call button next to it. And the game knows exactly what you want to do, because it tells you to press the call button. As with the ear defenders in PQ2, this is just bad design. If you know what I'm trying to do it. The challenge in an adventure game should always be figuring out what to do, not how to do it. Another early game example is the briefing room, where the game and all the characters shout at you to begin the briefing. You would think use podium might do that, but the game just tells you that's not how you start a briefing. Talking isn't the right action either. Eventually, you spot the clipboard on the side of the podium, and using that does work. It makes me worry that, especially in the late game, you're going to get the answer dead right, but never do it because you're not doing precisely the method they decided on. And I can't help but think a LucasArts or Revolution adventure from this period would not be like this. At the risk of belabouring the point, you have no idea what the mission is, so you decide to go see if you can go for a drive. You work out you have to click specifically the door and not just the car to get in. Eventually you find you can click on the keys, and at this point it tells you you're in the wrong car. You click on the right car and get this cryptic message. So I go mooch around the police station a bit, finding my locker, that kind of thing, and the game decides I have enough stuff and tells me to call dispatch, who send me out to a nearby park to check out a disturbance. Which leads to my first daft death. I only have one viable location I can go to when I get in the car, so I assume this is just a transitional sequence. It is not. I'm in control in some form, and it hasn't told me about this, as I discover when I run a stop sign, crash off the screen, and the game instantly ends. Restore or restart are my only options, and guess who hadn't remembered to save yet? And that's rather the pattern. We respond to the call to go to the disturbance in Aspen, for which you have to do the driving yourself and work out you need to stop and get out of the car between the right two junctions using the map that came with the game. None of this is in the manual, which I have read cover to cover. Here's some good example of Sierra jank. The guy is an alien fantasist causing a disturbance. He steals your badge and throws it in the river before jumping in himself. If you go back to your car, he'll disappear, and as far as I can tell, even with 2 walkthroughs, will never return. You can no longer complete the game. What you have to do is grab his keys and throw them in the river after him, which to me feels like destroying evidence rather than sensible policing. But it draws him out, at which point the hourglass that has until now meant you don't have control stays up until he punches you and apparently kills you. What you have to do is get your nightstick out, which will work, and go through hitting him and cuffing him. You take him to the station, where you have to put your gun in the locker outside, something you'd only know if you'd looked at the lockers before. Using your gun on the lockers doesn't work, so you walk in and get fined. What you again have to do is use locker, then use your gun on it. There is no reason to be this obtuse. Inside, you search him for a knife and then book him in for concealing a knife. Which very much begs the question, on what grounds did you think you arrested him in the first place, since you didn't know about that crime? What you'd have booked him in under if he didn't have the knife, I don't know. The code I typed is listed in the manual. It's not a huge list, so you wonder why the game doesn't give you a pick list. To the degree you wonder why it asks you at all. But that's 2 instances already where if what we've done hasn't been outside the law for a policeman, it bloody well should be. This is important because in all other respects this is a game that drills procedure into you at all times. And if you based your decisions on that, you'd have a hard time getting even this far in the game. The final incident in this prologue is a traffic stop you get directed to, where the heavily pregnant suspect is refusing to sign the ticket. This you stop at automatically in the car, even though you had to stop in the road for the park and actively turn off the road into the police station. She's rude to you. She's rude to the original officer. She tells you to take her to jail. If you do, the game abruptly ends because she sued the department. This is a simple 50-50 choice. The game makes clear at the beginning that it's not the glamorous depiction of police work shown on TV. But the problem is, TV shows those bits because they're the fun bits. I don't doubt a bit of realism would be interesting, but it needs to be combined with considerate and consistent mechanics both for doing the right thing, e.g. the locker incident, and the wrong thing, e.g. not forcing you back to a save for the traffic stop choice. It is though, at this point, plot starts, as we're taken to a cutscene of Sonny's wife leaving work, and it turns out she has in fact not played Knifey Spoony before. For some reason, Jimmy Hoverfoot wants to tell us the story personally, as she ends up in a coma in hospital. At that point I'll leave it to you for spoilers' sake if you want, but for me, the combination of the old school design of Sierra and the Jim Walls delivered police procedural demands just make this one step too far for today's gamer. I want to enjoy it, but it keeps making things too difficult for me to do so. And I do see why we moved to mostly LucasArts from around this time. So we return to Sierra's story, and to their credit, over the next few years they did try some innovation. They had success too, most notably with Roberta Williams' CD adventure gorefest Phantasmagoria, that relied heavily on full motion video. You could make an argument this was the third major advance Sierra and Roberta were responsible for. Phantasmagoria wasn't quite the first proper FMV point-and-click. You could argue the Seventh Guest, or Under a Killing Moon, depending on how strict your definition. But it certainly would have been the first for a lot of people. It was a huge risk, costing an absurd for the time $4.5 million to produce, and shipping for the PC on some 7 CDs, and for Sega Saturn on 8. It was a commercial success though, as was Jane Jensen's Gabriel Knight trilogy. A side note here, by the way. Jane Jensen made one adventure game after leaving Sierra, 2011's Grey Matter for Xbox 360 and PC. It's set in Oxfordshire, has an astonishingly great soundtrack, and it's my single favourite adventure game of the century. It'll cost you £7 on Steam, and CEX will sell you a 360 version for £1 more. Highly recommended. Around this time though, the Williamses were looking to get out, after the best part of 20 years of solid work. CUC International showed the financial nous that 3 years later would leave them involved in the biggest accountancy scandal before Enron, and reportedly paid Ken over $1 billion for the Sierra business. The Williamses then stayed with the company for 18 months before quite literally retiring to a yacht. Good for them. The downfall of CUC is a story in itself, but ultimately Sierra ended up in the hands of Vivendi, who basically sacked everyone and effectively closed Sierra as a viable entity in the traditional sense in 1999. The name lived on as a publisher until it was dumped in 2008 by new owner Activision. Several games that were supposed to have carried the Sierra name did survive in various hands, including Crash and Spyro games, as well as Prototype, Wet, 50 Cent Blood on the Sand, and Brutal Legend. You wonder if any of those might have changed things. Sierra went quiet until a 2014 revival as an indie online publisher funding smaller produced games. The move was welcomed by Ken Williams at the time, although he was still not involved. Ultimately though, this produced only 4 games, the most famous of which are Geometry Wars 3 and a reboot of King's Quest. As far as I can tell, in 2020, the Sierra name is once again dormant. It's always the way really. Sooner or later, the innovators get a bit too comfortable, and the next younger, hungrier companies arrive. Nonetheless, through Mystery House and King's Quest, Sierra very much created an entire genre, and there are not many who can say that. It remains a big part of my childhood and my relationship with my family, my father still recommending me adventure games he's played to this very day. Perhaps we don't need their logo slapped on anything going to remember them as one of the very front line of true pioneers of our hobby.
Damn it.
As if to prove the point that Sierra games were both popular and difficult, some poor bastard wrote into the resident Games X tips guru this month, prompting an awful joke about King Graham's tights. Their main problem was trying to get past a cart in the village, which it turns out you don't even have to do in the game. I'd sure hate to be that guy who has the same name and address as me aged 11. Oh. Crap. Right back in episode 15, we talked about premium rate phone-ins.
Come on, Cole, check back! 50!
Sorry, that keeps happening. Anyway, we were suspicious that they never seemed to print their winners, or any proof that there even were such things. Games X claims to. An advert towards the end of the magazine claims Abigail Singer won a competition at some point in the past. Given the page has 10, you wonder who won the other 9, and how often they awarded prizes. I also wonder if Abigail was actually the MD's daughter. So here's a long shot. Do you, or did you, know Abigail? Are you Abigail? Do you know anyone who genuinely won one of these premium rate competitions? Drop me a note on Twitter or in the comments, I'd love to know. But in the meantime, we've got a hell to deal with. Second time in 2 episodes we have a game called Thunder Something, but this time it's at the other end of the show. Thunderburner though is not a helicopter sim, but a shoot 'em up in the vein of Space Harrier, but with robots. This isn't a great sign. Games X gave it a greater than symbol out of 5 X's, which equates to 1 out of 10. I don't like Space Harrier in the first place. We've again got a choice of formats here, with the lead review system being Atari ST, with a near identical Amiga version we'll ignore, and an Amstrad CPC port which, quite frankly, I'm going to need to see. But first, that ST version. And I'm honestly baffled at this intro, so I'm just going to let it run a bit with a headphone warning for the start. Yeah, not sure what's happening there. Getting into the game, it's indeed a bit Space Harrier, but without the verticality. Which, in a way, helps me. One of my problems with Space Harrier is that I can never really work out where to be to hit an enemy. And the simple two-level system here, where you're either a robot, or for limited periods, a plane, does make that easier. It doesn't change, though, that it's not that interesting. Enemies consist of pillboxes, and a few enemy ships. And it's difficult to get much momentum going a lot of the time, and the game doesn't flow especially well. There's also a lot of periods where I don't seem to be doing a lot. Taken from an I didn't pay 25 quid for it perspective though, it's not irredeemable. It's a pleasant enough basic little arcade shooter that doesn't look too bad on the ST, and provides at least a brief distraction as an emulated quick go game. Weirdly, if you're going to play one game from this episode, I'd almost suggest this one. Police Quest 3 is going to require commitment. It took me 4 or 5 hours to get as far as I did to get the footage for that section earlier, and I haven't in any meaningful way started that game. This though I spent about 30 minutes on. That's probably enough for me, but it's arguably been less frustrating than any given 30 minutes with Police Quest 3. Can't disagree with the review though. As a full price game, it's not worth it. It was never worth it. It's thin and doesn't really have any of the one more go replayability that's vital to justify an arcade game as an actual purchase. There's not a lot to say about it. It's exactly what it looks like it is, and from a 2020 perspective that's actually kind of okay. Just before we go, it seems only fair to show you the CPC version as promised. Oh no. Oh no. This has all the classic symptoms of a half-arsed Spectrum to CPC port. It's slow, it's in monochrome, it's got a restricted view. The thing is though, this game never came out on the Spectrum. The CPC could do some amazing things when given the chance of a proper native piece of programming, and this just isn't it. Gameplay-wise, it's the already iffy Atari ST version, but without any of the redeeming features. I do love, though, how they've made the robot hover, because they couldn't animate the walk. That Amstrad Action never bothered to review it, despite doing an entire cover feature on the strength of the French CPC market around this time, which included a box out on publisher Loriciel's, probably says all we need to here. Before we hit the back page, a final side note. If you have incredible taste in gaming documentaries, you may have seen this channel's series on Distinctive Software Inc., the single biggest games developer you've never heard of. I won't spoil it here because it's a great story, but despite being one of the most respected sports game developers of all time, 1991 was not their heyday. They appear twice in this very issue. First, 4D Sports Boxing comes within a less than sign of being the worst game in the episode. They're right, it's awful, and it didn't get less awful when another publisher later tried to salvage it. DSi also did some arcade conversions for Sega, and Altered Beast is a re-release in this issue. Now, regular viewers will know my love for Altered Beast is about even with my love for invasive bowel surgery. But even so, the DSi conversion was a bit of a mess. They had done better before, and much, much better since. But that's a story for another day. Back in January this year, to be precise. On the back page today, another YouTube channel, this time Coffee Hound Retro Sharka, with a style so relaxing I've christened her gaming's answer to Bob Ross. Sharka brings a friendly and knowledgeable style to quick plays of classic games. On Twitter, these are as short as 2 minutes, but the joy is in the half-hour versions on YouTube. Tell her we sent you at the links in the description. But that's us for another week. Subscribe to us, exactly like you couldn't to Games X, for more. And we'll see you next week for more old magazines being right. See ya!